Alright, so in the last video we looked at declaring variables with var, let, and const. We looked at some of the naming conventions, some of the rules of creating variables and naming them. Now what I want to do is talk a little bit about the types of data that we store in those variables. So we're going to look at a couple slides and then we're going to jump in and we're going to write a little bit of code to explain this a little further. Now in JavaScript, there's a bunch of different types, but there's basically two types of data types, and that's primitive and reference. All right, so I don't want to go too deep into this, but I do want you to have kind of a basic understanding of it. With primitive data types, the data is stored directly in the location that the variable accesses. It's stored on the stack. When you access primitive data, you access it by its actual value. All right, now reference types are objects that are accessed by reference. So the data isn't actually stored in the variable. It's stored on what's called the heap, which has to do with dynamically allocated memory. And like I said, I don't want to get too deep into this because it can get really advanced, and I want you to get the gist of it, but I want to still focus on writing JavaScript, not all of the inner workings. But it is quite interesting and maybe something that you want to look into after taking this course and after you have a really good grasp on the language itself. So in JavaScript, there's 6 primitive data types. Okay, first we have strings, which are sequences of characters. They can be letters, numbers, symbols, whatever. We have the number type, which is just that, a number. Now it's important to know that integers, decimals, floats, these are all considered numbers in JavaScript, okay? Unlike some other languages where there's, decimal types, there's floats, and they're treated as separate types. In JavaScript, these are all considered numbers, okay? Which makes it makes things much easier. So we also have a Boolean type, which is true or false. We have null, which is an intentional empty value. And then we have undefined, which is a variable that has not been assigned a value. Okay, so if you just declare a variable but don't put a value inside of it, it's going to be undefined by default. Okay, all variables are undefined by default. Now, I'll talk more about the differences in null and undefined in a little bit. In addition to these 5, we also have symbols now with ES6. Symbols are a little more complicated than the rest, so I'll get into those later on when we get into, when we really get into ES6. All right, so reference types. Reference types are not primitive. They're not accessed by the actual value. They're accessed by reference, okay? And they're also considered objects. So arrays, object literals, functions, dates, and anything else you can store is going to be a reference type, okay? We also have object wrappers for strings and numbers, which we'll get into later. So JavaScript is what's known as a dynamically typed language, and this means that the data types are associated with the actual values and not the variables themselves. So the same variable can hold multiple types, meaning it can hold a string and then it can be set to a number with no errors or issues, and it's absolutely fine. Whereas in most languages which are statically typed, like Java, C#, this isn't allowed. In fact, many languages you actually have to define what type of value is going to be in that variable. So you would have to write variable something, string, or int, or float, or whatever type would be allowed in that variable. Okay, this is much different than how JavaScript works. Now, there are technologies that can turn JavaScript into a statically typed language. For the most part, TypeScript is the most popular. It's actually a superset of JavaScript, and what that means is that it's everything that JavaScript is plus more. It has extra features, and static typing is one of those added features. Okay, we also have other modules and add-ons like Flow or Flow.js, which can give us typing in JavaScript. But at its core, it's very dynamic in nature. Alright, so what I want to do now is jump into VS Code, and we're going to create some variables that hold different types. We're also going to take a look at the type of operator, which classifies value types. Alright guys, so this is going to be pretty simple. We're basically just going to create some variables with different types, and we're going to just take a look at those types using the operator type of. Okay, so let's start off with primitive types. So we'll say primitive. Okay, so we have strings. So we'll say, I'm going to use const here. So let's say const name equals, and we'll say John Doe. All right, so what I want to do now is just do a console.log, and we can use this type of operator. So we'll do type of space and then put in the name of the variable. All right, so let's go ahead and save that, and it'll run. And down here in the console, notice that it says string. All right, so it's just telling us that this is a string. Next, we'll create a number. So we'll say age, and obviously numbers do not have quotes around them. Okay, so if we put quotes around it, it'll be a string. In fact, I'll show you that in a second. But let's go ahead and change this to age and save, and we get number. All right, now if I were to put quotes around this and save, we get string. All right, another primitive type is Boolean. So we'll say const, let's call this one has kids, and we'll set this to true. Okay, Booleans do not have quotes around them. If you put a quote around it, it'll just be a string that says true. All right, so let's change this to has kids and save, and you can see that we get Boolean. All right, so the next is null. So let's say const, and we'll set a variable called car equal to null. And then we'll go down here and say car and save, and notice that we get object. So in the JavaScript world, this is actually kind of a mistake, kind of a bug. And let me just pull this up just to show you, because it's a little tough to explain. So if we were to just Google type of null is object, you'll see right here in Google, it says the first implementation of JavaScript values were represented as a type tag and a value with the type tag for objects being 0. And null was represented as the null pointer. As a result, null had 0 as a type tag, hence the bogus type of return value. All right, so it's essentially a bug. It doesn't mean that null is in fact an object. It is a primitive type, okay? But you will get object if you go ahead and run it through type of. All right, so the next primitive value we have is undefined. So for undefined, we're actually going to use let, because we'll get an error if we do not define a constant. So let's say undefined. Let's just say test, I guess. And we'll go ahead and say type of test and save, and we get undefined. Okay, we also have symbol, which, as I said, is part of ES6. So symbol is a new primitive type. So we'll say const sim equals symbol. And we'll change this to sim and save, and we get symbol. All right, so those are all the primitive types in JavaScript. So now let's take a look at a couple reference types. All right, and these are going to all come back as objects. So we'll start with an array. So we'll say const, call this hobbies, say movies, music, and then let's do a type of hobbies and save, and you can see that we get object as the type. All right, we can also do an object literal. So let's do address. We'll just put city and state. And then we'll change this type of to address. And save, and we get object. All right, last one I'll do is a date. So let's do const today, and we'll set it to the date constructor. So we need to use the new keyword. And we're going to get into dates and times. We're going to dedicate a whole lecture to it, but let's just go ahead and do that. Actually, I'll show you what that looks like if we console log it as well. All right, and then we'll just pop that in here as well and save. So that's what the date looks like, and then you can see it is an object. All right, so those are some of the reference types. But just remember, these are the 6 primitive types in JavaScript. These are This is what you actually access when you set this variable to this string. This is the data that's actually being accessed. With these reference types, they're being accessed from memory as a reference. Alright, so in the next video we're going to take a look at type conversion, where we can turn a string into a number or vice versa. Also look at something called type coercion. Alright, so I will see you in the next lecture.